were the Old Testament scriptures written in order to help a ancient people feel better about themselves when invading armies were coming in? Did they tell themselves, well, the reason this invading army came in is because God is upset with us? And so they wrote in some ancient book, which we today call the Hebrew Scriptures, that the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians, they came in and they conquered us because Yahweh, our God, was upset with us. Did they do that in order to explain to themselves their situation? Well, that's the view taken by people who don't believe the Bible. That's the view taken in this book here by Yuval Noah Harari. He's not coming up with this view. It's a very old view, but it's a view that looks at the Bible and says this is purely natural. This is just the way that ancient people who didn't know science, they didn't know the way that the weather worked or the way that other nations worked. This is how they made sense of the world. Well, what I want to submit to you is that if you think about this for a second, that view of the Bible starts to dissolve. And I think the reason for that is that if you do a thought experiment, if you don't believe the Bible, imagine, for the sake of argument, that the Bible's true. Right? So imagine, for the sake of argument, that there is a God, and this God is trying to get his people, who he calls Israel in the Old Testament, he's trying to get them to worship him. That's his goal. And he tells them, hey, if you worship me, it's going to go well for you. You're going to have grain, and your crops are going to grow. You're going to have food, and the invading armies aren't going to come in and kill you. That's what a lot of the Old Testament's about. How do we have enough food? And most often, how do we avoid invading armies killing us? So if it's true, imagine for a second, if it's true that God is trying to get these people to worship him, and he's saying, if you do worship me, you'll have the grain, people won't invade and kill you. But hey, listen, if you don't worship me, and instead you go worship those other gods, the Egyptian gods, the Babylonian gods, the Assyrian gods, then I'm going to deliver you into their hands, and I'm not going to stop them from coming to kill you. Okay, so imagine if that's the situation. And then these people, they hear God say that to them, and then they say, well, we don't care what you say. We're going to worship those gods anyways because we want more than what you've given us. This isn't enough. We don't just want food. I want better food. I don't just want to not be invaded by an army, but I want to make a kingdom for myself, so we're going to worship these other gods. And God says, hey, okay, listen, you're sinning against me. He speaks to them through what the Old Testament calls the prophets. He speaks to them and says, hey, watch out. I told you. You're not supposed to worship other gods, but worship me. If you keep this up, I'm going to let those other armies come in and kill you. I'm going to let pestilence and famine come in as well. And then they keep it up. They continue to not worship him. And then God says, okay, I'm going to let these people come in and kill you. Imagine if that were true. If that were true, what would you expect the Bible to look like? If there really is a God, and if his goal is really for people to worship him, not because at all it's beneficial to him, but because when we worship God, that's when our hearts are truly at rest. Like Augustine says, our hearts are restless till they find our rest in him. If that's God's goal, to give us rest in him, Sabbath, Shabbat, through worship, if that's his goal, and in bringing us to him, what he does is he punishes us and disciplines us like a father disciplining his child. If that's true, then what we see in the Old Testament is precisely what we'd expect to see. And so people like Yuval Noah Harari, they say, well, this is clearly made up. This is clearly just people trying to make sense of the fact that the Egyptians are invading. And so they say, hey, well, the Egyptians invaded. We must have made God angry. We see tribes do that today in the world. And so they explain the Bible in that sense and say there is no God. And this is evidence that there is no God. It's evidence that the Bible is not true. But what I want to submit to you is that makes sense. I'm not saying Yuval's point there is illogical. I'm not saying that. It's very logical, and I believe that actually happens in other cultures. But what I am saying is, on the other hand, if the Bible were true, this is precisely what we'd expect. And so taking that story that Yuval and other people present, it doesn't actually disprove the Bible. It's a compelling narrative. It's a way to explain the Bible. But that explanation is just as valid as the Bible's explanation for itself, which says that this is a description of the way that God works with his people. So it depends on what your presupposition is. When you come to the Bible, if you say there's no God, like Yuval says, you're going to read it like, oh, this is just stories of people making things up to make themselves feel better. If you do believe in a God, then you're much more likely to read the text and say, well, this seems true to me. And so it's important for us to recognize that as we read the Bible, because Yuval and stories like these that he presents, they're not evidence against the Bible. What they are rationalizations that we can choose to accept if we don't believe in God. So that's just making you feel better if you don't believe God. It's not actually disproving him.